To the jury. What do you guys got in terms of witnesses? You have two more today or one more?
One more, Your Honor.
Okay, that's the expert.
Dr. Nicole Graham, yes.
Is she here?
She's been testified by Zoom.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, there she is. I'm going to admit her now.
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay, can you hear me? Is it Dr. Graham? Can you hear me? Dr. Graham, can you hear me? Oh, it's muted over there. Dr. Graham, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
You're asking if I can hear you, no.
Okay, thank you. It's okay. It's that one. That one's got the mic. I have to wait. Just wait a second. No, because the jurors are walking in. Huh? Yeah. Go ahead and bring him in.
Bring him in?
Yeah.
Okay. Just touching it. Jury.
Okay, Bill.
We are live.
All right. I think you're going to have to move the camera out this way a little bit, Bill. And then pin the screen.
Good.
That's good enough? Okay, okay. All right, defense, your next witness.
Your Honor, I can go briefly with my client on the matter that we're waiving the rule of second escalation as to expert witnesses. And I just want to explain that to you.
Go ahead.
The defense is waiving the rule of second escalation witnesses with regard to expert witnesses.
Very well. I think each side, this is typical, not unexpected. Are you ready to go with Dr. Graham?
Yes, Your
Dr. Graham, can you hear me now?
Yes, Your Honor.
If you can, please raise your right hand and be sworn.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give these calls will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
All right, welcome. Mr. Anderson will be asking you some questions first. The next voice you hear is Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Graham, would you please explain your educational background?
Sure. I obtained my bachelor's degree in 2010 from the University of South Florida with a double major in psychology and criminology. Obtained a master's of science degree in clinical psychology in 2012 from California State University, Fullerton. And in 2019, I completed my Doctor of Philosophy in Clinical Psychology from John Jay College, located in New York City.
And what types of clinical training experiences did you receive before you became a licensed psychologist?
Most of my training has fallen within the realm of forensic psychology and neuropsychology. In the process of training for my doctor in clinical psychology, I was involved in conducting violence risk assessments for a pretrial diversion program in Brooklyn, New York. I worked conducting neuropsychological evaluations in a private practice in Manhattan. I also conducted neuropsychological evaluations and psychiatric treatment of individuals in a psychiatric unit of a city-based hospital in Brooklyn. I also worked at a federal detention facility, also in New York City, in which I did forensic evaluations relevant to competence to stand trial and mental state at the time of the offense. I also conducted neuropsych evaluations in what was a epilepsy center of a hospital in New York City, although we did see a variety of individuals with varying neurocognitive concerns. I completed my predoctoral internship at Central Regional Hospital, which is a state forensic hospital in North Carolina, while also serving a year-long rounds at University of North Carolina Medical Center, where I was involved in neuropsychological evaluation. And then prior to my licensure here in Florida, I did postdoc fellowship in 2 private practices, one focused on forensic psychological evaluations and the other with neuropsychological evaluations.
What are your current positions?
Currently, I have a private practice in Fort Lauderdale, where about 60% of my practice is involved in forensic evaluation in some regard. And then the other, I would say, probably about 20 to 30% in which I am doing general evaluations for individuals in the community, neuropsychological evaluations of adults of varying neurocognitive questions. And then about 10% of my time I teach, and also I have a research lab where we explore neuropsychological, forensically related questions.
What professional associations do you belong to?
The American Psychology and Law Society, National Academy of Neuropsychology, American Psychiatric Association, the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, and then the Florida Psychological Association, and also the Florida Division for the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers.
Have you ever been qualified as an expert witness?
Yes, I have.
How many times?
I've been qualified in Broward County on 4 occasions.
And have you been previously retained by defense lawyers in a criminal case like myself on some other case?
Yes. Yes.
For what types of evaluations?
Largely mitigation, some competence to stand trial, mental state at the time of the offense.
And there's no question of competence or insanity in this case, Dr. Graham. And so I'm not going to ask you questions about those. I'll skip that over. Have you ever been retained by the state, by the prosecutors?
Yes, I have on 7 separate occasions.
How do you remain current in the best practices of forensic neuropsychology?
There's a variety of ways of remaining current in your profession. So those associations that I referenced earlier, they all have email listservs, essentially, in which we get daily, weekly emails that are for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're announcing conferences, other times they are looking for consultation, other times we are discussing new research that has been published. Certainly, I follow my licensing requirements, which require 40 continuing education credits over a biannual span, but typically I am exceeding that, given that I am attending CE credits at least once to twice a week, attending national conferences as well. I am also a journal reviewer on 2 separate journals, in which basically the editors of the journal will send empirical research that authors are looking to publish, and they send it to reviewers who are considered to be have specific expertise in the field to review the research to make sure it is adequate enough to reach the merits of publication. I also, as I mentioned earlier, have a research lab where we are vested in continuing research in the field.
All right, this next question may have already been answered in that last bit you said, but here goes. How do you become a peer reviewer?
A peer reviewer of a journal article occurs in a variety of ways. So for one of the journal articles, for one of the journals I'm a peer reviewer on, I applied and was accepted as a PhD student. I thought it would be good training, and then I just stayed on with that journal. And then the second journal, I was specifically asked by the editor of that journal to if I would serve as a peer reviewer, given my expertise in the field.
Your Honor, depending on how you do this, I will tender this witness as an expert in the state at this point.
The witness can express an opinion.
Thank you. Dr. Graham, have you met with Robert Hayes?
Yes.
When was that?
I met with him on January 3rd and January 4th of this year.
Did you review anything in this case?
Yes. I reviewed several employment records, educational records from University of North Carolina, Charlotte, La Cordon Bleu from Atlanta, Bethune-Cookman, and Palm Beach County School District. Medical records from Carolina's Medical Center, St. Mary's Medical Center, and Florida Department of Health of Palm Beach County. I reviewed the life history report provided by Ms. Fuentes, the mitigation specialist. This report was published or written in early January, I believe, so if there's been anything more recent, I do not have that. I also reviewed the Williams rule ordered, as well as the Palm Beach County probable cause affidavit for the West Palm Beach case.
The last answer was drowned out by something that on your end. Can you repeat your last answer after the Williams rule order?
Williams rule order, as well as the Palm Beach County probable cause affidavit for the West Palm Beach case, a review of Mr. Hayes' journal writings, a review of his resume, and the neuropsychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Eisenstein. And then I conducted telephone interviews with Mr. Hayes' current girlfriend, Shawnee, his ex-girlfriend, Miss Janina Holt, and his mother, Miss Florence Hayes.
Did you conduct neuropsychological testing?
Yes.
What were your overall findings?
My findings from my testing with Mr. Hayes, broadly speaking, he is an intellectually adept individual, so his intellectual abilities are between the high and even above high average range, and that was largely consistent across all domains of his cognitive abilities. So when we look at language and memory, visual spatial skills, where there was a relative weakness, though, for Mr. Hayes was within his executive functioning abilities.
What do you mean by relative weakness?
So when we look at, when we go about scoring all of these neuropsychological tests that we use, we want to look at them compared to kind of what the average population does. So we refer to it as this kind of normal curve of how we expect people to perform on these tests. And we look at these test scores in comparison to other people of various demographics. One important demographic is age, because we know it is just normal for us as we get older that we aren't as sharp as we used to be. So we in one aspect, we compare individuals to other people that are of similar age or ethnicity or gender, education, things like that. And so when we look at people who are, when we are looking at this normal kind of comparison to the average population, and somebody has a frank impairment, a neurological impairment, then we're going to expect that those scores are going to be falling significantly below or impaired our kind of average population, which is, for example, what we would see with like Alzheimer's disease. So an older individual, when you compare that person to other older individuals, the one with Alzheimer's disease is going to be, their memory abilities are going to be far lower on that kind of normal distribution, normal than average. But then aside from that, we also want to compare individuals amongst kind of themselves. So we look at their pattern of scores. And this is particularly important for those who fall on the very low end of that kind of normal distribution curve, because at the low end, we know that intellectually this person's perhaps intellectually disabled. So we don't want to look at their other cognitive abilities compared to the average person who's intellectually average. We want to understand them at this lower range of functioning. And same when we get to that other end of the curve. We have people who have intellectual abilities who are higher than the average. And so we would expect that overall, all of their cognitive performance should fall on that higher range. With Mr. Hayes, we see where there's this relative weakness for him, whereas he's not wholly neurologically impaired in his executive functioning abilities, but compared to what he should be capable of performing at, he wasn't performing in that higher average range.
What exactly are executive functioning abilities?
Executive functioning is our higher order cognitive processes. So sometimes referred to as like the CEO section of our brain. It is our commander. It is the part of our brain that's responsible for planning and organizing our behaviors. So it's our ability to make goals and to reach those goals. So that means defining, when we have immediate impulses or gratification that we want to obtain, it's being able to inhibit that, or rather it's our ability to inhibit those impulses so that we can act in responsible way in order to reach our long-term goal. So it's our ability to plan and organize, it's our ability to be future-oriented, our ability to learn from mistakes, to kind of change our course of action when we have new competing things that come into our environment and we need to be able to shift and plan our behavior to adapt to new situations so that we can reach our long-term goal or ultimate outcome.
With regard to this patient, Robert Hayes, was there other evidence of weakened executive functioning abilities demonstrated throughout his life?
Excuse me. Certainly. So, if anything, his recent conviction, there's a plethora of research that has demonstrated that that implicates deficient executive functioning skills and sexually assaultive or violent behavior. But if we take out just the conviction alone, we see this type of deficient executive abilities throughout his, at least throughout his late teenage years and into adulthood up until his recent arrest. Given that he is functioning from an intellectual standpoint at this kind of higher end, we would have expected him to be able to succeed and have probably had the capability of having a career and had been successful in that career. Unfortunately, though, that's not what we've seen with Mr. Hayes. So starting in college, where on average, you typically complete your college degree within 4 years. For Mr. Hayes, it took 6, in part due to a change in his degree program 3 different times. And then within that time and within kind of the decade or 2 decades thereafter, there's been almost kind of a repeat of the same types of behaviors. So that's engaging in substance use, a variety from alcohol to a variety of substances throughout his 20s and 30s. That's him engaging in a variety of kind of, I don't want to say marital relationships, but dating relationships, being involved with dating multiple women at one time. There's been numerous unplanned pregnancies. I am aware that he was the father of 2 children, but aside from that, there were kind of that irresponsible pregnancies that took place throughout his adulthood. Frequent changes in employment. Many of times his employment was terminated at the face of any sort of perceived slight or criticism to his abilities to being able to be an effective employee. And so rather than being able to approach the situation and think constructively of ways to work through those employment issues, he would typically quit, walk out. Other poor judgment in other places of employment in which there were sexually explicit text messages sent with colleagues. And this is in the context of him being a father figure and having financial demands, both of at first 1 child and now 2 children, as well as supporting his family. We've seen other sort of financial irresponsibilities throughout his adulthood in terms of being able to pay bills, housing, paying off his cars, or if there was something that happened to a vehicle that was owned by somebody else, paying the individual back. So throughout, I would say, the past 20 years or so of his adulthood, there's been numerous incidents of this failure to plan, delay gratification of things that he wanted to seek out and reach long-term goals in terms of being a father figure and having a steady place of employment.
What causes these deficits in executive functioning abilities?
There's a variety of factors. So there's certainly biological predisposition that can contribute to impaired executive functioning. I think that is relevant in Mr. Hayes' case. Given his father's background, there does seem to be, again, a history of risk-taking types of behaviors, criminality, sensation-seeking. We know that aversive childhood experiences can also impede the developmental processes of our brains, and certainly substance use is not a beneficial factor for brain development.
And could being molested as a child be a cause of such a deficit of executive functioning abilities?
It is certainly a traumatic, aversive childhood experience that we know that it, like I said, related to deficient brain development.
And this expression using adverse childhood experiences, this is kind of new science in relatively recent decades, isn't it?
I would say at least since probably the last 20 years or so.
That's recent to somebody my age. And can you explain what that means, adverse childhood experiences?
Yeah, and I would argue, and there's been research in this area since at least the late 80s, but I mean, growing and developing, and in part, I would even argue implicates what we know about juvenile brain development and how we go about assessing juvenile culpability. But nevertheless, Adverse childhood experiences are a host of events that can occur in childhood. So childhood physical abuse, emotional abuse, any sort of neglect, be it physical neglect or emotional neglect, not having your needs met, homelessness, not having food on the table, the death of one or both family members engaging in alcohol or substance use, any sort of familial history of mental health problems,
So,
incarceration of a family member as well.
so to recap, your testing and your work with this case has led you to conclude that Mr. Hayes has weakened executive functioning abilities. Am I right? Am I saying that right?
That would be accurate.
Did you come to any other conclusions in this case?
With respect to,
Any thing that would adversely affect impulse control, self-discipline, planning?
well, I think everything that's been discussed, I mean, it's more than just in thinking about the makeup of our brain, there's also social and psychological components of being in an environment that is not emotionally nurturing, where you're not learning effective problem solving skills, where individuals in the home aren't taught how to kind of have conflict in situations and appropriately deal with them. So there's a whole host of factors that's a kind of a cascade or snowballing effect that affects how we go about our interpersonal day-to-day lives as an adult.
With regard to adverse childhood experiences, could having one's father killed, being murdered, be an adverse childhood experience?
Yes.
And so, such adverse childhood experiences, let me clear this up, might also include excessive corporal punishment at home. In other words, physical punishment, commonly called whooping, that goes too far and crosses over to abuse. Could that be considered one of these adverse childhood experiences?
Well, it could be. Generally speaking, yes.
When you say deficits of executive functioning, the way you describe it brought to my mind like the chief executive controls a company and keeps it from going haywire, keeps it moving in the right directions. Am I conceptualizing that in the right way, or is that a bad characterization?
I think that is aligned with what I had said earlier about, it's the CEO. It's kind of the decision maker of your actions.
Maybe that's what got me thinking when you said CEO. Perhaps that did it. All right, so really, a person with deficits in executive functioning is kind of like a company without a leader, a ship without a tiller. Am I thinking along the right lines?
So you have to kind of, yes and no. I mean, there's people who have significantly impaired like executive functioning abilities, and then there's people who have deficient executive functioning abilities. You'd expect them to be stronger for where they're at, and so that's what I see with Mr. Hayes. I don't think that he's wholly impaired, like we see with people who have significant frontal issues, but for Mr. Hayes, what we see is just this kind of uneven development in his abilities. We see advanced functioning in areas where deficient or less than what we would expect abilities in his executive functioning.
And I think you've answered all my questions.
Yes, sir.
No further questions.
All right, any cross-examination, State?
Yes, Judge. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
I want to start by going through a couple things from your report that you issued in this case. You said on direct examination that you did interview Mr. Hayes, and you met with him on 2 separate occasions, correct?
That's right.
And that's January 3rd of 2022 and January 4th of 2022, right?
Correct.
Okay. And this included an interview with Mr. Hayes, right?
That's right.
And do you recall in that interview Mr. Hayes telling you that he was never physically abused by any caregiver?
I do.
And do you recall Mr. Hayes reporting to you that he was never emotionally or psychologically abused?
Yes.
And do you also recall speaking with Mr. Hayes about and also looking at some medical records? I think you may have had a few medical records that you were able to review, correct?
Yes.
Medical records from, I believe, the Carolinas Medical Center, St. Mary's Medical Center, and the Florida Department of Health from Palm Beach County.
Correct.
And isn't it true that Mr. Hayes, there was no documented history of Mr. Hayes ever suffering any type of head injury?
That's correct. That I've been privy to, yes.
Nothing that was given to you showed any history of head injuries.
Correct.
And also, in interviewing Mr. Hayes and reviewing his records, that included a psychiatric history, correct?
Say that again?
Your interview and reviewing records also included building a psychiatric history for Mr. Hayes, which you included in your report on page 5.
Yes.
And isn't it true that Mr. Hayes didn't endorse any psychological symptoms such as frequent worry, emotion, dysregulation, mania, or psychosis?
Those specific symptoms that you asked me about, I would sort of agree. The emotion regulation, I would question.
Now, during your interview with Mr. Hayes, you confronted him with some issues, didn't you?
Yes.
And how did he respond to that confrontation?
In part, he was willing to open up and accept my suggestion to him about the presence of potential mental health symptoms, but then also part of him minimized or was not necessarily in agreement with my proposition.
But he didn't become easily irritated or frustrated with you, did he?
Yeah. Largely, no.
Would you agree that on page 6 of your report, you indicate that Mr. Hayes did not become easily irritated or frustrated even when presented with mild confrontations by this evaluator?
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about your actual testing that you did in this case. We're going to go through some of those tests now. I think they're on page 7 of your report. The first several tests are validity testing. Could you tell the jury what validity testing is and why it's important that you give validity testing?
Sure. Well, with respect to cognitive abilities, you want to make sure that somebody is putting forth effort. Otherwise, if they're not trying hard enough, then the results wouldn't be necessarily indicative of what they would be able to actually be able to do.
Often called as a term that is often used in your field. You know, somebody might be malingering or not performing as well as they could.
Yeah, and malingering can also be relevant to psychiatric symptoms, but with respect to this, it's cognitive ability. So whether or not malingering would be if they're attempting to present as intellectually deficient.
And on Mr. Hayes' test that you gave him, they were all within expectation, correct?
Right.
And what does that mean, that they're all within expectation?
It means that he was giving his best effort.
First, I want to talk to you about the next battery of tests after the validity testing, the intellectual function. In that case, you gave a total battery intelligence index score of 117. Is that correct?
Right.
And that was in the 87th percentile?
Correct.
And just so the jury understands, when you're saying someone's in the 87th percentile, does that essentially mean that if there's 100 people in the room, that person scored better than 86 of the other people?
Yeah, it means that there's, yes.
Just, I mean, to simplify it as much as possible. Basically, that's what it means.
Sure.
So you'd agree that on his total battery intelligence index, he was in a high average range of the 87th percentile.
Right.
And for a total intelligence index, he scored a 122, correct?
Yeah, 93rd percentile, yes.
And that's above average?
Yes.
And for the crystallized intelligence index, he scored 122 as well, correct?
Right.
Also in the 93rd percentile, correct?
Correct.
And also above average.
Right.
And then there's some subtests in that category, right?
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but they're general knowledge, odd word out, and word opposites.
Correct.
And in those, starting with general knowledge, Mr. Hayes scored in the 97th percentile. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's an above average score?
Yes, on that test, yes.
And the next test, the odd word out, he scored in the 69th percentile, correct?
Right.
And that's an average score.
Right.
But still, saying the percentile, he would be, if you have 100 people in the room taking the test, he would score better than 68 of them.
That's right.
And going to the word opposites, he scored in the 79th percentile, is that correct?
Correct.
And that's in the high average range, isn't it?
Right.
And was the next battery of tests you gave the fluid intelligence index?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't necessarily next, but yes, that's one of the
Okay.
tests.
I'll put it this way, next in your report.
Yes.
And on that subtest, well, actually, for the fluid intelligence index, he scored a 115, right?
Right.
Putting him in the 84th percentile,
That's right.
and also in the high average range.
Right.
Down to the nonverbal analogies. In that testing, what percentile did he score in?
97.
And is that considered above average?
Yes.
And for the next subtest, sequences, what percentile was he in?
50th.
And where did that put him in terms of verbal score, verbal range?
Average.
Next on your list, the quantitative intelligence, he scored a 103, right?
58th percentile.
58th percentile, is that average or above average?
It's average.
Average. And the two subtests, the quantitative knowledge and quantitative reasoning, did he score in the same percentile in both of those tests?
58.
And where does that put him on the verbal range?
Descriptor would be average.
Average. Moving next to the memory tests. Could you describe generally what the memory tests are for? What are you trying to determine from those testing?
Verbal and visual, one's ability to learn verbally presented information as well as visually presented information.
And I'm not going to worry about going through all the percentiles on these tests, but I just want to ask you as we go down through them. From the standard form, total trials 1 through 5, what verbal range was he in there?
73rd average.
And what about list B? Where was
50th percentile average.
She said 50th percentile average. The short delay free recall, where was he there?
63rd. I'm sorry, 75. And that's really falling at the upper limits of average, so
Okay.
above average.
But your report says high average.
Okay. It's
Is that
above.
a yes?
Yeah.
Sorry, your typing's very small in these reports. Let's see. What about the short delayed cued recall? What was his percentile and verbal score there?
63rd average.
And the long delay free recall, the next one down, what was his percentile and verbal score there?
Free recall was 75th percentile, or cued recall was 84th percentile.
And are those both,
Above average.
are those both in the high average?
Above average, yes.
And what about the test that's known as recognition hits? Where does he score on that?
84th percentile.
And does that put him in the high average?
Above average.
And you're saying above average, but on your report you're saying high average, right?
Okay.
Is that a yes?
Yes, high average.
And false positive errors. What was his percentile and his verbal score there?
50th percentile in the average range.
So thus far, all the testing we've talked about, would be fair to say Mr. Hayes has scored either average or above average or high average.
Yes.
Moving on to the brief visual spatial memory test, the total trials 1 through 3. What was his percentile score there?
98.
And where does that fall on the verbal scale?
Exceptionally high.
Is that as high as your verbal scale goes? Is exceptionally high?
As a descriptor, yes.
I mean, there's not I guess if it's 100, you could say perfect, right?
Right. I
Okay.
guess. That doesn't exist.
Okay. Delayed recall, the next test down, what percentile was he in there?
91st.
And where did that fall on your verbal scale?
Above average.
And for the next 3 tests, the recognition discrimination index, the recognition hits, and the false positive errors, were all the scores basically there within normal limits?
Correct.
We're going to come back to the executive functioning test that you gave, so I want to go down and talk about language. For the NAB language model Form 1 on oral production, what was his percentile score?
4th percentile.
4th percentile. And that is what on the verbal scale?
Below average.
And what does that test, that oral production test, what does that tell you about this individual?
Well, not much from this in the grand scheme of things, but that test specifically looks at one's ability to, as the name implies, produce expressive language and their ability to provide details of an image, a detailed image of a picture.
But that's not one of the battery tests that's under executive function.
Right.
Going to the next test for naming, what was his percentile and verbal score there?
62nd percentile, the average range.
And was it the same for the writing test, 62nd percentile and average range?
That's right.
For the next test, the RAIT, General Knowledge Test, what was his percentile and oral rating?
So these are all the subtests from the rate that we've already discussed, but 97th percentile above average.
Okay. And the next one down, the odd word out.
69th percentile average.
And the word opposites.
79th percentile high average.
And next on the visuospatial, visio-construction testing, the rate nonverbal analogies testing, what percentile was he in?
97th above average.
And for the rate sequences, what was his percentile?
50th percentile average.
And then for the sensory motor, the groove pegboard test for the dominant hand, what was his percentile?
50th percentile average range.
And what about the non-dominant hand? What percentile and what verbal score?
38th percentile average range.
And keep your report handy, Doctor, because I'm going to come back to the executive functioning in a second. Before I get there, I want to go back to your evaluation of him, interviewing him, and his psychiatric history. You didn't diagnose him with any type of mental illness, did you?
No, I didn't at the time of this report, no.
And you didn't that includes that you did not diagnose him with autism?
No.
You did not diagnose him with Asperger's?
No.
And doctor, in regards to executive functioning, would it be fair to say that executive functioning takes in all of a person's abilities and it controls them and basically modulates their behavior outputs?
Yes.
Would it be fair to say it's an individual's ability to inhibit themselves from reacting?
Yes.
It's basically an impulse control, right?
That's part of it.
It's an ability to have judgment in situations and act accordingly.
Yes.
And in this case, you gave multiple tests to Mr. Hayes to evaluate his executive functioning, right?
It's not entirely true.
That's not entirely true. Well, you also looked at, are you referring to looking at Dr. Eisenstein's testing as well?
Yes.
And then you gave some additional testing. You didn't repeat the testing of Dr. Eisenstein, right?
Right. I didn't repeat testing. I was cautious in belaboring testing with Mr. Hayes, and also several of those tests that you might be thinking of measure executive functioning aren't necessarily measures of executive functioning. It's attention, processing, speed.
You talking about the ones that are under the header executive functioning?
That also says attention, yes.
Okay. Well, you can explain it as we go through them. So these tests that we're about to go through their attention and executive functioning, right?
And processing speed, yes.
And processing speed. First, let's talk about the symbol digit modalities test. The written test. What percentile did he score in?
78th percentile.
And what was his verbal score? What's the verbal range that falls into?
97th percentile.
On the written, was it, sure it's not 78?
I thought that's what I said, but written is 78th if I didn't say that.
I'm sorry, I thought you said 97. On the symbol digit modalities test for oral, what was his percentile?
97th.
And verbally, where does that put him?
Above average.
Let's go down to the DCATS design fluency test. And I'm sorry if I'm butchering any of these. Condition 1, Phil Dots. What was his percentile?
91st.
And where does that put
Above
him?
average.
Above average? What
Yes.
about the next one, empty dots testing?
37th percentile average.
And condition 3, switching?
95th percentile above average.
The next testing, total set loss errors?
75th percentile high average.
And the total repetition errors?
25th percentile average.
So far, everything in this subcategory, attention and executive functioning, he scored either above average, average, or high average. Right?
So the lower limits of average, ranging up into the above average range.
Okay, well, your report doesn't say anything about lower limits of average, it just says average, above average, and high average, right?
Then I would have to make the font even smaller for you.
And I would not be able to read it, man. I appreciate that. Let's see. Let's go down to the DCAS tower testing. The total achievement score, what was the percentile?
50th percentile average.
And the total rule violations?
75th percentile high average.
And the move accuracy ratio?
9th percentile low average.
9th percentile medical report. So for all these testings in this category, Mr. Hayes only scored one score below average, and that was the low average for the move accuracy ratio.
Which is arguably the component of the executive functioning part of that test.
And what part of your brain handles executive functionings, ma'am, doctor?
Several areas of your frontal lobe.
And you talked about some of the things you observed in Mr. Hayes' history that indicated to you issues with his executive functioning, like his employment history, right?
That's one of them.
That's one of them. Would you agree that a lot of that information, particularly the employment history, that occurred after these murders in 2005 and 2006?
It's hard. I can't keep his employment history straight, frankly. There's been so many. I think it's largely characteristic that he's had short-term employment since he became employed around 18 and up.
And doctor, would you consider evidence of the ability to diffuse a high-pressure situation or a situation when confronted with violence as evidence of good executive functioning or on par executive functioning?
One domain of executive functioning would be able to kind of talk yourself down in a situation where you could react violently.
And what about even acting as almost a mentor to somebody, talking to them about how to look to the future and plan your business and helping them develop this plan moving forward in their life? Is that evidence of good executive functioning?
I guess it depends on if the outcome is succeeded.
So having good executive functioning only speaks to the outcome? I mean, you can have good executive functioning and still have a failed business, can't you?
You can have many goals but never exceed them, never actually reach them.
And doctor, in your experience, when individuals have issues with executive functioning and thus issues with their frontal lobe, do you know whether or not those issues with the frontal lobe would appear on PET scans and MRIs?
It depends. It depends on how great any sort of neurological impact it might have had.
Based upon your experience, would you expect with Mr. Hayes and his executive functioning issues that you've testified about today, would you expect to see issues on his or things come up on his MRI or PET scans?
I can't speak for that. I'm not a neurologist.
I'm guessing not a radiologist either.
No.
Doctor, this is actually the first case, you've testified for death penalty mitigation, right?
That's correct.
And Doctor, back at the time of your deposition in this case, back on January 13th of 2022, we talked a little bit about your hourly rate. What is your hourly rate in this case?
$200 an hour.
And back at that time, you testified you had worked 58 hours. Approximately how many hours have you worked on this case now?
Haven't billed since that time you have asked me, but
An estimate is fine.
probably another 20 hours.
Give me one moment, Doctor. Doctor, I had to get my calculator. Is that about a little over $15,000?
Like I said, I haven't billed. I haven't done the math myself either.
Okay, but about 78 hours, you said. About 20 hours on top of the 58 you already did.
If that's what the calculator is telling you, I will agree. I will say that my first bill was just short of $12,000.
Okay. Well, I'll defer to my iPhone then. Thank you, ma'am. I have no further questions.
Thank
Any
you.
redirect?
Yes, ma'am, just a second.
Yeah. I'm sorry. The name? Graham. Nicole Graham. Thanks for waking me up.
All right, Dr. Graham, just to make sure I understand your testimony, you concluded that Robert Hayes had relative.
They can't hear you. They can't, the jurors can't hear anything. Turn the witness's mic over to you. This mic over here. No, not that one, this one right here.
Oh, this thing?
Yeah, turn it over that way and then you can get just close to it, yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you. All right, so if I understand it correctly, what you found is relative weakness in executive functioning abilities, correct?
Yes.
All right. And am I correct in my understanding that a person can be an intelligent individual, maybe can do well even on a college entrance exam or something equally challenging, and still have relative weakness in executive functioning abilities? In other words, the
Sure.
two, is that true?
Yes.
Now, we've had some neurocognitive imaging work done in this case, but that's not been a part of your work, has it?
I have not seen any of that imaging.
Okay. That's all I have.
All right, thank you. Anything else?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, Dr. Graham. You're excused.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Bye now. All right, can I have counsel sidebar just real quick? I don't need the defendant, I don't need the court. All right, folks. I was just trying to get an idea. We're going to adjourn for the day, but get an idea where we are and what to expect based upon what I told you earlier. Everything's still the same, on track for we to give the case to you on Wednesday. Tomorrow, don't want to run late, but we're going to push tomorrow through it as best we can. It's going to be a long day, so just be prepared for that, okay? All right, so leave your nose face down. Remind you not to talk about the case with anybody. Don't let anybody tell you anything about the case. Don't do any research on your own, okay? See you tomorrow. I think we're at 8:30 tomorrow. 8:30? Yeah, 8:30 if you can. You got to shut. There we go.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, we will be in recess until tomorrow at 8:30, okay? Thank you. Are you going to be here tomorrow? You have gotten lucky every single time. Every single time.
Sounds like we clean women under.
There's